Hello, everyone. I'm Cory.
And I'm Isaac.
And today we are going to be talking about movies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So today what we're talking about is the movie The Farewell. We just watched it in theaters a couple days ago.
We did. Directed by Lulu Wang, a breakout filmmaker whose only prior feature film is from 2014, a movie called Posthumous that neither of us had heard of before looking up her filmography.
I think this is kind of a breakout hit for her.
Definitely.
Doing well critically, and as far as I know, box office, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's doing well last time I checked.
I know the per theater averages for it have been exceptional. Certainly got a lot of buzz around it, and it was a Sundance darling.
Mm-hmm.
It's at 99% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is what the people want to see these days. So
yeah, true. They put that on like movie posters now, yeah.
It's certified fresh.
Yeah. All
the ingredients of a sleeper hit, maybe one of the early 2019 Oscar contenders, dare I say. We'll see.
Yeah, just your classic indie hit. Critically, like you said, reviews have been exceptional. I've heard about it since it came out at Sundance, saw the reviews, the mini reviews and stuff since its theatrical release. Everyone is calling it like a perfect film, critically lauded. So if you haven't seen it, it is, like we said, directed by Lulu Wang, starring Awkwafina, and a couple other character actors. I know Tsi Ma, who plays the dad, is relatively famous. He has a couple bit parts in movies and television shows in the US. The mom, Diana Lynn, I don't actually know what she's been in. I do know that the person who plays the now infamous grandma, they call her Nai Nai in the movie, is extremely famous in China. Yeah. And this is her first US release film.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Her name is Zhao Shuzhen.
Long-time actress, like, since she was young?
Yeah. She, apparently, from what the small bits that I've read, is the most experienced actor in the film.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Lulu, trying to find her, realized how famous she was, basically, tried to, like, ask her personally to be in this film, and it was a really big deal. Like, we don't realize that because she just has her own thing going on in China and hasn't really broken to the U.S. market yet.
Especially interesting, I think, given that she plays a very unassuming character, obviously an extremely important one, and one that has a lot of... I think it's a demanding role.
Probably certainly the most memorable, I would say, in the movie.
The most memorable performance. But at the same time, it's relatively understated, and her character doesn't have a whole lot of like agency in the film. She's not the primary protagonist, even though she is an important figure in the film. So, it could be that she's kind of a character actor for grandmas and whatnot. Either way, she was a revered person on the set. So the other actors and her had a certain relationship that was kind of almost like she was the head of a matriarchal family. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so for those who haven't seen it, we are going to be spoiling the movie again in this podcast. We'll give a warning before we really dive into the hard and heavy spoilers. I don't think that this is a film where narrative spoilers are going to incite as much rage as your Avengers or even
our last one, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That was a pretty big deal ending, so... Yeah, on this one, although I think we both agree the ending was a pretty crucial part of the movie.
Yes, we definitely want to talk about it. Both of us came away from this film with very positive impressions of it. I think it's near the top of both of our lists of films that have released so far in 2019. And at the same time, there were some very different things that struck both of us about this movie, which is perhaps the mark of a really great movie in that it's just very rich with things to notice and consider.
Like Isaac said, I don't think there was a lot we really want to critique so much as just dive into the complexities of what's going on. In this one, what I noticed most was less about the direction, but I really liked that. And mostly what I was interested in was the writing and how Wang portrayed her characters that are based off of a story that she takes from her personal life. So, background on this, the plot of the movie is that the main character is played by Awkwafina. Her name's Billy. She is living in New York with her parents also live in New York. They came over from China. Billy's grandmother, who she calls Nai Nai, the family finds out that she has cancer and decides not to tell her. What they do is they all go over to China together, the whole family that's under Nai Nai, and decide to stage a wedding, big event for her to plan in order to all hang out with her, be with her in her last couple months or less.
The premise has hints of a heady exploration of grief, contrasting of cultural values, and also sounds a little bit like the premise of a gonzo dark comedy, which is not at all what The Farewell is. But
Yeah.
that's just to say that there is a lot to pick apart just in the premise of this film.
Yeah, it's a really heavy subject, really difficult to put into a film perspective. And I think what I attach most onto this is that she's actually drawing it directly from a real experience, right? Her grandmother had this exact same situation, had to go through this whole instance. Her family decided not to tell her. Obviously, she was conflicted enough about it to make a whole movie about it. Interestingly, the presentation of what ends up happening, it is about discussing the grief and discussing all the complex nature of what's going on. There's a lot that the film tackles in a short 1 hour and 40 minutes, but the main focus to me seemed like a tribute to that real life grandma through the portrayal of this seemingly fake story with fake names and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the Lulu Wang stand-in this case is Billy, played by Awkwafina.
Interestingly, sorry to cut you off. Interestingly, she was actually picked for this movie before her other 2 famous roles that recently, what was it, Ocean's 8 and Crazy Rich Asians. This was in discussion, production, before that it even happened. So it was kind of even more of a gamble, and seems like Awkwafina had an even bigger acting role payoff in this one.
Yeah, this is being hailed as, I think, her dramatic breakthrough role.
Right. Only lead performance so far.
She has plenty of endearing, goofy, cute moments, and also has a few quite wrenching emotional scenes that she's asked to carry on her shoulders, and she does a really fine job on both of those extreme ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. I think Wang saw in her that she could tell a lot of the story just with her emotion, right, without even saying anything. And I think she tried to use that to the best of Awkwafina's abilities.
Yeah, a lot of shots of Awkwafina looking at things, and they don't feel empty or unnecessary.
Yeah. And what I thought was even more unique than just a really good performance in a lead role by an up-and-coming actor was the character itself. This obviously has huge attachment, I would assume, to Lulu Wang, since she's basing it off of herself. The character, even just portrayed in the movie, says so much about her direction and writing style. I thought it was a really fascinating and unique experience to see a writer-director, especially a new writer-director, putting themselves essentially in a movie. Obviously, this is not a documentary. It is fictionalized. A lot of it is. But the character Billy, even with a focus on a large ensemble cast, we see instantly that she displays a lot of emotion. They don't even want her to come to China because they know that Naina will be able to tell that she's sad for some reason, try and figure it out. But she's also a writer, right? Just like she is in real life. In the movie, she's trying to get a scholarship of some kind of grant foundation. Guggenheim Foundation grant. So she must have some ability to convey stories, to tell lies, so to speak, or to invent the truth in a new way. You would think it's an interesting comparison, and you instantly pick up on that at the beginning of the movie.
That's a very interesting point. I think that some of the doubt that the other characters express in terms of her ability to keep the secret that is central to the film's plot comes from this suspicion that she is too Americanized, or perhaps is more American than Chinese, and has been brought up in this environment where the expression of emotions is encouraged in different settings than it is in China. And sorry, so I just wanted to insert that in there.
No, yeah, I think that's a good segue, going into talking about the very specific cultural aspects of the film.
Yeah, so the whole contrast between the American way of coping with grief and loss versus the Chinese way. This is an idea that is proposed in the trailers to this movie. It is immediately presented, the duality, the two worlds aspect of the film is something that is portrayed throughout the entire duration of the film. And there's this central speech given by Billy's uncle that's lifted and put in the trailers where he talks explicitly about this East-West difference in the priorities of people in terms of their role as individuals in the West versus their place in a larger family structure that carries more significance than the individual in the East. And it's obviously an enormous oversimplification, but it's still proposed as a thematic backbone of the film.
It's very important to remember that this is all based on the perception of one person's experience right. I don't think Lulu Wang is trying to objectively say about one thing or the other. She's just trying to give her own experience, and her character literally is experiencing that. So I think that's an interesting parallel there also.
Yeah, maybe the immediate instinctual reaction when this dichotomy is proposed. I think I've said the word dichotomy in both of our episodes so far. I'll try to plot that into every episode as kind of an Easter egg to our loyal, consistent listeners.
At the end of one episode, you'll just go, dichotomy. And
Anyway, there's a tendency to leap to the question of, well, which way of coping with grief is more effective? What is the right way? Is the film going to come down on this issue on one side or the other? What do you think?
It's certainly right. Going into it, my own experience, I thought she's going to decide one way or the other. She's going to put her own perspective in because it's about her situation.
Right. She'll either embrace her roots, or she will decide that she has a new life that she has established in America that she wants to continue.
Right. Interestingly, it ended up not really deciding at all. It kind of just leaves it at a natural point of posing the question almost to the audience. I think she's leaving up to personal values to decide. Because after the uncle talks about the American individualistic values versus what we talked about, collective value of Chinese people about their families, after that happens, we still see some wrestling, but there's never a definitive part in the movie where a character says, no, this is the way, or Awkwafina especially, her character never says, no, this is the way. They just, to say what happens at the end of the movie, they just leave thinking that that's the last time they're going to see her.
And I think that's one of the most refreshing aspects of this film is the inconclusiveness. The fact that it does not force its protagonist to make some grand stance on this issue that I think in real life, if we imagine ourselves in a situation similar to this, which is very hard to do, obviously, it would be completely unreasonable to expect a person to come to some definitive conclusion that they feel completely okay with, right? You would expect someone to go through this situation and feel a variety of intense emotions and be pulled this way and that by the different perspectives present in one's life, and then to come away from the experience certainly with more perspective and food for thought and emotional personal growth. But that emotional personal growth would likely take place over the course of many, many years.
The growth that Billy experiences in the movie is very subtle, but still noticeable. Going back to how the characters are kind of drawn, because there's so much focus, there is a lot of focus on Billy, but because there's also some good focus on the other characters of the film and her interactions with them, we have to see her portrayed as a bit of an archetype. Awkwafina's character using some stylized action in the movie, right? Like the scene that I'm thinking of in particular is the slow motion where they're all looking at the camera, or when they all race over to get the medical records and change it, right? There's some franticness in what's going on, and it's a little bit over the top portrayed, but it never feels fake because we're grounded in such a real intimate story. And I think the way that she uses that in all the characters is really crucial. All of them we can boil down to their character elements, and yet none is a cliche, none is a stereotype that you would traditionally use in a family dynamic. We all know they have complexities. We know that they have other things that are happening in their lives that are mentioned, but the way that they interact in the family, we see only small bits that tell a lot.
I would love to hear you talk more about specific characters and how you feel that they fit into that. But I also, before we move completely on to that, I would like to say, while we're still on the topic of Billy specifically, another scene that comes to mind is the scene in the hospital when she's talking to the doctor who speaks English, and she asks very forcefully and very directly, is it okay to lie to my grandma? Is this something other people do? Is this something I should be feeling bad about? And the doctor's response is equally straightforward, something like, oh yes, this is something that is very normal for people in China to do, and I did it with my own grandmother. And in that moment, it's such a simple question, it's almost obtuse, but she is really, I think, in that moment acting as a stand-in for the viewer, grounding the viewer that might not be familiar with this custom in the reality of the situation, which just allows the viewer to consider everything that they're watching with a little bit more perspective on how other cultures function.
I think it's a mark of a really good filmmaker that we're able to put ourselves in a character that we don't know how much we can identify with their situation, right? Because I know I've never had this exact situation happen, and yet we're able to draw a lot of universality out of this. And I think that's a really interesting mark in a film that's so culturally specific.
So do you want to maybe expound a little bit upon some other characters in the film that evoke that sense of the profound archetype?
Yeah. I think it's a combination of a lot of things, right? It's a combination of the writing, directing, and also the acting. We talked about Awkwafina's performance that gives her character as much or more complexity than the writing itself does. The same is true with her parents in the film, which are played by Tzi Ma and Diana Lin. Both are very different and have their own significant qualities, right? We have the relatively stern father and the emotionless, seemingly mother at most of the way through the film, but the small interactions that we get between Billy and her parents and the parents themselves are so revealing to me. I loved the scene, the small bit where the mom is walking the dad back into their hotel room as he's drunk, right? He's kind of rambling at this point. She just walks him in, kind of scolding him, but at the same time, very helpful, doing literally everything for him in order to get him into bed, right? It didn't seem like a routine. It just seemed like a genuinely loving and helpful thing that she isn't able to express with words. Directly following that scene is when the mom mentions that she doesn't like to put her emotions on display. And I think that, in hindsight, reflected a lot of her actions in the film, right? Mm-hmm. She mentioned earlier, what is there even for me and the husband? What is there even for us to disagree about, to argue about, right? They are feeling like they're going through everything together.
Speaking of not putting emotions on display and Billy's father, another great example of this very simple characterization that is just so effective is the moment in the film where Billy's mother is talking to Nai-Nai, and Nai-Nai has noticed that Hai-Yan, who's her son, has been acting strangely, that he seems troubled, and specifically she said, oh, his face seems puffy. Mm-hmm. That, for the viewers, it's a dialogue drop that he has been crying, that he is very viscerally and deeply affected by his own grief. And yet we never actually see the character cry on screen, mm-hmm. which is a great example of how the film expresses without really saying or showing that much.
Yeah. The aspect that I was thinking of on that was that he starts drinking and smoking in the film to kind of cope with the grief. That could easily be thought of or presented as, oh, this is another coping mechanism that people use, right? Using him as a tool to say something. But you never get that sense. You never question that ever, that's just a part of his character that he is internally struggling with. They mention it earlier in the film, right? The mom says, oh, your dad's lying down. Billy goes, oh, is he drinking? Mm-hmm. It's a background thing that happens that they use. It's not like he is an alcoholic or something, but they use that simultaneously as a way to say this is a way that people cope with grief, but also this is a personal character aspect that he is trying to deal with his grief in a very not on-screen way.
Yeah, I think that's a really great encapsulation of the point that the characters in this film very genuinely feel as though they have already existed before the events of the film and will continue to exist and develop after the film has ended. Just like Billy will continue to process this entire experience and come to terms with what has happened, so will all of the characters.
Yeah, I've never seen so many characters in a film that have so many small, like, human details to them that are very instantly capturable. Because of how they're used in the film. It could have been a random detail, like just a random place thrown out, that the other half of the family moved to Japan around the same time that Billy's family moved to the US. But instead, it's used as like a kind of background point that they're relatively closer to China and still are in an Asian country, and the uncle feels still connected to his Chinese roots. And not only is that used in that way, but it's also played for laughs with the Japanese girlfriend who doesn't speak Chinese. Mm-hmm. And she is just a silent figure in this whole film, smiling. And there's a lot of moments where we get to see her reaction because she can tell what's going on. But is unable to express or communicate with anyone else in the film.
Right, and her fiance, Billy's cousin, also a practically silent character, although he does have a line or two.
It's a combination of, he seems like he's a quiet, sensitive person, right? A characterization for him. And he also seems like he's on the verge of crying in every scene because he's dealing with the same thing that Billy's going through, losing his grandmother.
And he's present during this very memorable sequence at the fake wedding where the characters are all positioned around the table and they're playing a game of some sort, or it's like a word game.
Yeah, it's like I think you do the chant and then like signal to the next person to do it, right?
It reminded me of like, this is a game of concentration or something like that, but I don't know if
I think I've played one similarly where you you say something, right, the thing you have to say, and then like use that to direct to another random person or a specific person in the circle. And
it's a very striking sequence. The camera is spinning around.
Right, it's in the center of the table.
In the center of the table. It's stylistically distinct from the rest of the movie. It's very fast-paced, and it's inserted right after a moving speech where the uncle breaks down over his mother's impending death, and the cousin is the key figure in that sequence, and that's where he ends up having that sort of emotional breakdown moment.
Yeah.
And for me, at least, watching it, I was a little bit like, whoa, like, what? This is a little bit out of nowhere. We haven't really gotten anything from this character before, like, but it didn't bother me so much as it just drew attention to his grief even more.
Yeah.
It was...
And that's, that happens when you drink, right? It's both a coping mechanism and puts your emotions on display more.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you were saying there about that scene tells so much about the tone of the movie, right? It's such a gloomy subject in the presentation, right? If you read the general synopsis, like you said, what you said at the beginning, it's kind of dark. It could be very serious, very straightforward, but instead it's very light for the most part. It's very taking advantage of those joyous moments. I think it's time to spoil the ending. I noticed that so much more the second time watching the movie with you because I already knew that the grandma was still alive to this day. The real life grandma of Lulu Wang. I noticed all those lightweight elements before that seems to me that she is looking back on this as a fond memory with her grandmother, right? All the other aspects of Billy dealing with it in her own way, right? With the grief and all the characters with the grief. Very sad, very moving, brings you to tears. But the interactions with the grandmother, very joyous, very playful.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of out of nowhere humor that the grandma says, right? She grabs Billy's adult butt and like talks about it.
Yeah. I always have loved touching your round bottom or something.
Yeah, just things like that, like that only a grandma would say and do. That just contributed so much of a different and cool experience to me the second time.
I didn't know how the film was going to end, but I still experienced a lot of those scenes as being very lighthearted and joyous, and they're described as such by I'm thinking specifically Billy's mother comments on, Billy will continually say, like, don't you think we should tell her? Like, shouldn't we not have her doing these sort of trivial things day to day since she is going to be dying relatively soon? And Billy's mother always retorts with this, hey, look at her, like, she's happy, she's enjoying herself, she's having a good time, basically. And this living in the moment idea is, I think, the film almost like simulates that. It allows the viewer to live in these joyous moments and to forget the context surrounding them that would normally make them very heavy and morose.
Yeah, it seems like Billy's character is kind of like the standard voice of reason in a crazy situation initially, but by the end, you don't get that sense at all. It's almost the opposite. It seems like she's still trying to internally process it and doesn't really know what side she stands on, right? And that kind of leaves that open-ended question by the end.
Yeah, she's certainly not positioned as being wrong, but she's not positioned as being right. So at the end of the film, we're left with what is initially a relatively ambiguous, open-ended scene in which Billy is walking through the streets of New York after bidding her grandmother farewell for what she assumes to be the last time. And Billy lets out this cathartic "ha," which is a means of spiritual cleansing that her grandmother was trying to teach her in this,
expelling the badness,
the bad vibes, basically. That scene is in its own way just wonderful. And so it's a callback to that sequence, and it's Billy, embracing some aspect of her grandmother or perhaps experiencing some catharsis thanks to the wisdom that her grandmother imparted onto her. It's certainly a poetic moment. And then there's this beautiful shot of some birds flying out of a tree, and it leaves you with this striking image, and you're ready to sort of think about the film as it fades to black. And then we're greeted with, immediately before the credits begin, this home video of Lulu Wang's real-life Nai and a caption that reads, 6 years after her diagnosis, Nai is still living to this day. You're left. That's the note that you're left on.
How it's portrayed is it's both a trope and unique, I thought, because it's portrayed as an afterthought to the true narrative part of the film, the true fictionalized part of the film, and then you have the classic tag-on pre-credits scene with, you know, what happened in real life, right? The postlude, so to speak, the real life depiction saying, oh, look, this is what the character's doing now, right? It's kind of a trope. To me, it feels like a plot point, right? We agreed before the show, before we started recording, that it seems like a crucial plot element, because it really is, right? We are taking this all as a real situation, right? A real situation with some fictionalized elements. And that last bit is pretty much the like crucial element that we're thinking by the end of the film, right?
And presentationally, it's presented as very much both of those things. It is a credits extra home video, like, oh, look what the person looks like in real life, like you just said, and yet the wording of the phrase that accompanies the image actually calls the woman in the video Nai, which is what we have been taught to associate with the grandmother character in the film. So it inextricably links reality and cinematic artifice. So it left me with this double-pronged feeling of wanting to reconsider what I had just watched, but also the deep-seated knowledge that it doesn't change what I just watched whatsoever. The self-contained film that precedes that image is the self-contained film that precedes that image.
I think it can change your perception. Like, for my situation, I felt more assured about Lulu Wang's presentation of the entire film after seeing that Nai was still alive.
What do you mean, more assured?
More assured in the fact that we're not marching in a few weeks to her death, right? We're not seeing her for the last time, so to speak. I mean, we are as people, but the character is the person that you've put yourself into is still getting to live on with her to this day, exponentially longer than they imagined.
So in that sense, it lightens the tone that you walk out of the theater with. The whole film is about coping with grief, and so to have the final image be this renunciation of that grief, this sort of statement of, oh, well, actually there's no reason at all to be sad, because look, she's still alive. Like, that's sort of the shallowest reading of it that I can imagine. Yeah. I don't know if that's what was intended. In fact, I don't think that's what was intended.
Right, that doesn't change the events of what happened in the movie.
Right, that's sort of what I was talking about before.
Yeah.
But you can read it that way. You can sort of walk out saying, like, oh, what a happy film. You know, she's still alive. Okay, like, we never have to deal with this. But it's a film about coping with grief. Obviously, it wants us to think about coping with grief.
How do you feel personally now about it?
I feel like the effect that the ending had on me was to take a bit of significance away from the individual story that's told in the farewell. Not in a bad way. It doesn't take away from the story that's told, but it forces you to recontextualize what you just watched in terms of other situations that arise on a day-to-day basis all around the world, right? Like, people die. Nai is going to die. We're all going to die, obviously. I think that if you read the film as entirely a personal, individual story, then the ending makes it shallower and less meaningful. But if you take the film as both a striking individual pseudo-autobiographical story and as a headier exploration of grief and cultural divides, then the ending doesn't feel shallow so much as it feels like it just... I don't know. I don't really know what my thought is there, honestly. I don't think I have a definitive thesis.
Are you trying to get towards, like, a universal element of the film?
I think I'm still a little bit undecided on how to feel about this ending,
Gotcha.
to be entirely honest. It really did strike me, and you were saying that you have, your readings on this film so far have suggested that it's not something that has aroused a whole lot of...
Yeah, my initial looking at random reviews after watching the movie, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of talk about it. It seems like a lot of people are kind of just saying Lulu Wang managed to put together, a great ending to the film. That's kind of in as few words as possible the sense, right? There's not a lot talked about that I've gotten so far.
It just feels so significant to me. It feels like
it deserves to be talked
really
about.
Fundamentally alters the way that you perceive a film whose entire purpose seemingly is to explore this question of how to handle grief and loss and death.
It's hard to wrap your head around philosophically, for sure.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's what I was trying to get at before, was this distancing of all of those philosophical elements from the individual story that's told within the film, and instead the suggestion that they should be considered on broader terms, and that Nine Eye is still alive. But does that make the explorations, the growth that these characters underwent worthless? Does that mean that all these experiences that they just had over the course of an hour and a half were for naught because they didn't actually need to cope with Nine Eye's death? No, I don't think that's what the ending is trying to suggest at all. And I think that that's what makes that ending so provocative for me, is thinking about, okay, here's the simplest explanation for why you would place this ending on this movie, and that just doesn't click at all with what the priorities of the rest of the movie seem to be. That's, I think, why my attention is drawn so much to this ending, and why I really want to continue to think about it.
I know that there's probably a lot of people who've had similar situations. I know everyone watching this movie, nearly everyone, I'd say probably 99%, has experienced death in some way in their lives, right? Whether it's as small as a pet, whether it's as big as a grandma, everyone who's watching the movie has experienced it at some degree. So there is some element of universal connection that we can put ourselves into Billy's character. And I know there's a lot of stories similar to this where the grandma didn't live, right? Where everyone finds out, hey, this person in our family has 3 months to live, and then they died. And that's what we thought was going to happen in the film until the very last frame.
Mm-hmm. And I think that ending the film without actually depicting the death of Nine Eye on screen would already have defied some of the tropes of similar films. But then the insertion of that extra bit is what really puzzles me. There's already a fair amount of ambiguity and food for thought by the time the film cuts to black, and then it chooses not to cut to black, but rather to make this direct connection between the real world and the film that was not made otherwise, except in the very first frame of the movie, which is a line of text that says, based on an actual lie.
Right.
I don't know what it means, and I don't know if Lulu Wang knows what it means either. And what I was talking about before with Billy's character not coming to any definitive conclusion on how she feels by the end of this film, but rather just having all these new experiences that are going to influence her as a person over the course of her life. That's what this movie did to me, in a sense. Like, it leaves you with these feelings and this experience that is profound and affecting, and it doesn't have some specific agenda or point that it wants to make. It just seeks to appeal to that very raw sense of humanity.
Going off your point, to me this film, why I think it's so unique is it's a rare instance of such a personal and intimate inspiration for a film. And I think the last frame contributes to that too, or the last real world shot contributes to that too, that she's making a film about grief and about death, but more so it's a tribute to a person that she loves, right? It's a commemorative piece to somebody that she holds as one of the most important people in her life. I think it's rare to see that in a film especially if it's like a biopic, right? The person who's writing, directing it could have some significant attachment to them, but it's probably not as close to them as their literal grandmother. That level of inspiration spoke to me. There's a point where in a situation that becomes so intimate and personal, since we've all had intimate and personal relationships with people in our family, it develops that kind of universality. That exact connection is what's creating that simultaneous, culturally specific and culturally divided film, as well as a universal one to anyone that's had an experience with a wonderful grandma or similar person in their lives, I mean.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's such a personal movie, even though it touches on such broad and potentially philosophical subjects.
I mean, how many films can you say somebody pitched the idea, I want to make a movie about my grandmother because I just love them so much, right? Boiling it down extremely. That's a lot of the sense I get from the movie, especially knowing that she's still alive, right? She hasn't had to think and deal with her death yet. So instead, it's a film about a specific situation that happened to make a very interesting story, as well as a continual timeline of the true-to-life story about a person that she loves.
And also possibly in very elaborate way to tell real-life Nai about this goofy thing that the whole family did a few years ago.
Yeah, hopefully she knew by that point, because that would have been a big shock to go into the theater and see her granddaughter's film.
Nai, you're famous.
Yeah. That's horrible.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting that no details are shared about how Nai is still alive, 6 years on, whether the diagnosis was just overly pessimistic. There's also the suggestion by one of the characters earlier on that there's this Chinese belief that it's not the cancer that kills you, it's like the depression that accompanies the cancer that
And I wonder how many people's perception of how people deal with death changed because of that. Like they say in the film, it's not the cancer that kills you, it's the fear. And
we
how
still
many
no
people...
fear in Nai. Like,
right,
we
exactly.
see only joy.
She's the most buoyant, joyous character in the film. And she never gets the chance to feel that fear, to feel that depression that comes with knowing that you're about to die. So maybe that's why she lived for 6 years longer, right?
Maybe so. And I think that if Lulu Wang had spelled that out for us, it would have felt extremely heavy-handed.
Yeah, definitely.
And come across as just like, happiness beats cancer, which we know is not
true. It's taken us 55 minutes to parse this out. So
happiness beats cancer.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a complex assertion that is only part of a much larger threading of themes.
Yeah, I think I bring that whole point up just more to clarify the fact that Lulu Wang keeps things nuanced. That stinger at the end of her living grandma doesn't boil things down and oversimplify them, obviously, because I'm stuck and still trying to articulate my feelings about it after we started talking about it 20 minutes ago.
Hey, if you find a film, guys, that Isaac can't fully wrap his head around after seeing it, I think that says something.
Oh yeah, guys.
Because we've seen a lot, and that's a feat, for sure.
Damn. That is a big compliment, Corey. I really appreciate that. I think there's definitely some films out there I can't wrap my head around, like Primer. Have you ever seen Primer?
Yeah, I've seen Primer.
Can't
that
wrap
movie
my head around that one. Yeah.
There's that point in the movie, if you're really focusing, and you still just completely lose it.
Yeah. Very similar film.
Yeah.
To The Farewell.
Pretty much the same plot,
Pretty much the same plot, but with a time machine in it.
Instead of
Anyways. Before we wrap up, one other element of the movie that I really want to at least briefly mention, it never came up naturally. It's one of those things that I took note of, though, because I definitely wanted to talk about it at some point, is the score, which...
Oh, yeah.
It just struck me as astoundingly beautiful. The
very
orchestral compositions are very evocative, and at a couple points in the film in particular, they're contrasted very strikingly with some very different music. I'm thinking of the wedding scene where this blaring electronic dance music comes on moments after this stirring orchestral score has accompanied the departure of the uncle off stage after he breaks down crying in front of everyone. So there's these big emotional back and forths that are conveyed using music.
Right. There's a lot of really cool aesthetic things about this film that are really the mark of a really good vision in a new director, right? You rarely see that in somebody that is trying to kind of coast on the rest of their career. It's something that comes from a truly inspired place in your life. And the score is a huge part of that. We get a large mix of previously made music, like you were saying, along with cool new compositions to fill out the film. The part directly after the electronic dance music scene at the wedding reception with the woman singing the Italian song, that's actually one of the most famous solo soprano vocal pieces in music history. So there's a lot of weight to each of the songs, and they're obviously very clearly chosen for their emotional and cultural resonance. You know, there's American songs, there's that Italian song, a lot of Chinese and other Asian songs, and that mix of different things also lends to, I think, a wider view than like saying one cultural aspect is more important than the other, because that's definitely never argued in the film.
So that just mirrors, I think, the film's stance on things.
And again, any way that you can like see the entire themes of the film through one lens of the movie, right? We're looking just at the score. We can see like we can pull out very important and significant themes. I think that's a really cool thing to see in a movie. Agreed.
Yeah. It just shows that the different parts have really come together into a wonderfully constructed whole.
Yeah, the random, seemingly random bird symbolism, right, that doesn't really affect the plot, but comes out in just a couple moments where there's the same bird that keeps coming into her
window in New York and in China.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, so many cool things like that. Aesthetic pieces, they don't seem thrown in at all, even if initially it seems kind of random.
Certainly. So shall we rank the films of Lulu Wang?
Yeah, so I would put that one first.
Yeah. And I haven't seen Death Proof. So.
Yeah. Posthumous at the bottom for sure.
Yeah.
Her short films that I know none of the names of.
Yeah.
In the middle.
But as far as future films go, I know I'll be on the lookout, as I'm sure will a lot of moviegoers, because this one is a really memorable experience.
Yeah, it's really striking a chord with the world, which I think is really great.
With that, I think it is time for us to bid you farewell.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's the name of the movie.
That's the name of the movie. Wow, we really should have started our Once Upon a Time episode by saying, like, Once Upon a Time.
No, that's stupid.
Okay, never mind.
That was not meant to shoot you down.
Well, it really felt like you shot me down.
That came out so mean. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. Thank you for tuning back in to our podcast. If there is anything that we just didn't touch upon that struck you about this movie, we'd love to hear about it. We have not really decided upon the structure of our podcast going forward.
Hopefully we'll talk about some older stuff as well as new. Get a mix. We don't know what we're doing next.
Yeah, so if anyone has suggestions or requests, we're considering those, but we'll plan to be back next week with episode 3. For now, farewell. And we hope you have enjoyed our discussion today.
Yep. Thanks for listening.
Like, comment, subscribe, baby. 20% off.
Yeah. Subscribe. Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Okay. Oh, you have to press stop.